We're at the INSEAD Energy Alumni Group Conference in London, and we're speaking with Michael Liebreich, and you're the CEO of Bloomberg New Energy Finance.
That's right.
Welcome.
Good evening.
Thank you. Earlier this year, you've published figures that are pretty astounding given that we're in a global recession. You said that there were $260 billion invested in clean energy in 2011, with the U.S. overtaking China in clean energy investment. So who invested all of that money, and in what did they invest?
Well, that's right. So the total investment in clean energy, $260 billion, what that covers is renewable energy, so wind, solar, biomass, biofuels, but it's also the enablers, so smart grid, energy efficiency, power storage, and a few other bits and pieces like carbon capture and storage, although very little is actually actively being invested there. So that's what's being invested, and you've already touched on where. The two big countries, US, China, as a region, Europe, and then right across the asset class chain.
Now, you've been, and maybe still are, a venture capitalist, an entrepreneur, a business executive, so you know where the money goes. How has the economic crisis affected investment in this sector? And I say that because I would assume a lot of the investment has been because there have been a lot of government benefits.
Well, so first of all, if you look at the type of investment we're talking about, the single biggest chunk is asset finance. It's not venture capital. That's a small bit. That's 3, 4, 5 billion a year out of the 260. The big piece is when you actually build a wind farm, or you build a biofuels plant, or you go drilling for geothermal, hot water and so on. So that's the big amount, and that immediately says debt, right? Because those sorts of projects have to bring in debt. You can't be economically viable just with an equity investment. So the crisis has been pretty dramatic, particularly in Europe, and particularly in Southern Europe. In the US, you mentioned in your intro that the US has overtaken China, and that's absolutely true. It used to be the largest country. Then China came along 2008, 2009, 2010, overtook the US, but then the US overtook back last year, and a lot of that is to do with some of the support mechanisms, the incentives, that actually they expired at the end of last year, and there's some more that expire at the end of this year. So there's a kind of dash for the line, because as you say, there are support required in order to keep the money flowing. So in the US, because there's so much pressure and so many mechanisms being reaching the end of their lives, that has actually spurred investment in the current period.
Because I noticed that the US investment went up by 35% and China went up by 1%. And the US still wasn't that much ahead of China, so Clearly there's a lot of opportunism there.
Well, I don't know if opportunism is the right word, but there's certainly, China surged in its investment in this space between about 2006 and 2010. I mean, China was just increasing at these figures, 35% a year, 60% a year, and so on. Huge investments in solar, huge investments in wind, and investing on the supply chain, so building factories, but also actually building out capacity, these enormous wind farms in Inner Mongolia that they're building out. So China had its growth phase and is now maintaining, and the US has been more equivocal, and it sort of hasn't sometimes, some years it's supported it, some years it hasn't. The mechanisms have been on again, off again, historically. And then with the crisis, a big slug of money, President Obama, the stimulus response to the crisis, targeted this industry amongst others. And so suddenly there was a big slug of money, and that's now really kind of flowed through. And so that's been the sort of slightly different dynamic than China.
So what does 2012 look like in terms of investment in this sector?
I'm tempted to say more of the same. China is still a major player, major investor. The US is still going strong. There's one of the main mechanisms for wind, which is the production tax credit, is due to expire at the end of the year. So there's a lot of people who are trying to get their projects up and running before then. So it's a very strong year. The question for the US is more what happens next year once that production credit is gone. And then Europe, it's really tough. I mean, the debt markets remain very nervous, very jumpy. Southern Europe, you're trying to finance a project. If you can get European Investment Bank involved or some of the soft finance, you've got a chance. Otherwise, very, very hard. But then some points of light around particularly offshore wind, offshore Germany, Holland, the UK, some big projects that are coming through the pipeline. And those are financeable because they're those countries, and Denmark as well. The Northern Europe is actually, the finance is still flowing.
And they're better off financially anyway, so that's kind of another reason to do that.
Yeah.
All right, it's been about a year since the Fukushima accident and the tsunami. Looking back on Japan, looking back on nuclear energy, because that was always sort of nuclear and gas seemed to be the ones that could do a big scale, global scale. Is nuclear still an option? Has it recovered a little bit from the shock of a year ago?
So Fukushima has reshuffled the cards once again. And there have been certain sort of phases in the acceptance of nuclear, and then there's been accidents historically, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and then it's gone into its sort of fallow years where really it wasn't on the agenda. And it was just coming through. The nuclear renaissance was what everybody talked about. And then Fukushima has had a very interesting effect because it's been quite granular. So in Japan, what you see now is the number of operating power stations has almost dropped to zero. So every time they're going into maintenance, they're not coming back online. So there was an immediate drop after the accident. They're now not operating. Some of them will probably come back online because once they're built, the electricity is very cheap, but the public acceptance is really very low, and faith in the system in Japan is not being restored. So the cronyism, the worries about the lack of a whistleblower culture remain. And so we're seeing in Japan some emphasis on, well, obviously gas, but they have to import it. Coal, they'd have to import. Renewables, some emphasis. So in July, there'll be the introduction of a tariff for solar rooftops, and that's probably going to jumpstart this, or re-jumpstart the solar industry in Japan, which used to be quite healthy. But the biggest focus has been energy efficiency and demand shifting, because it's so here and now, and the Japanese have got world-class skills, and it sort of fits culturally and economically because they've been leaders in energy efficiency. But what's really interesting about Fukushima has been almost the impact outside Japan, where you see Germany and Switzerland and Italy saying, that's it, we always knew this stuff was dangerous. They're not near earthquake zones, they haven't had a nuclear accident, but just the public support has entirely evaporated. And Italy had a referendum and the figures were just extraordinary. It was 96% said no nuclear. And so the effects have been more marked in Europe probably than anywhere else in the world.
Except that France still has 85% of its electricity generated by nuclear power.
Well, that's it. France does, although France's response was to instigate a set of what they call stress tests to say, well, okay, we've always assumed that we're the safest in the world and so on. Let's have a look at that. And those tests, those studies have now come back with a series of recommendations which will add costs to the French nuclear program. And so I think, France will remain a nuclear nation, but it's going to be more expensive than expected. And 85% is probably the wrong number for any country because what they also have is a set of downsides of nuclear. You can't switch it off when demand drops, which means you end up dumping it very cheaply on your neighbours, so the neighbours are happy, but you're essentially subsidising their energy consumption. And then it has, there's discarded heat. It's a thermal technology, which means you have to somehow
cool it down,
dump the heat away. And so when you've got hot summers, heat waves, you're ending up with river temperatures and coastal temperatures of the water rising. So you end up shutting down your nuclear just when you start to have air conditioning demand and so on. So I think that France will happily maintain its nuclear fleet, but it's not something that every country can go and emulate.
Let me end by asking you, and since you actually give out investment grade information, maybe you can really answer this question. Is the idea of clean energy, is it ever going to move beyond sort of the boutique stage and become of a scale that would actually serve as a primary source of energy or become real?
So the question is a kind of, when did you stop beating your wife question?
A little bit, yes, a little bit.
Because Germany, Europe's largest, Europe's most dynamic economy, 21% of German electricity last year was from renewable energy. Now, to me, that's not boutique. given that we want diversity, how far do you want to go with any one source? So you've already got to the point where Germany 21%, Texas 8% wind, California 5% wind, Denmark over 20% wind. You know, big, serious, proper economies are now really using a lot of this stuff. Brazil, okay, they've got very good hydro resources, have always been heavily renewable. So has Norway, so has Iceland. But these are now big industrial economies like Germany and Texas that are starting to get meaningful volumes. And so part of the issue is that people like you who say, will it ever be more than boutique, haven't actually realized that it is far beyond, it is a decade beyond being boutique. And so part of the challenge is to understand that it's not just that it's beyond boutique, but it is also inevitable that it becomes the main form of energy. And therefore, regulation has to take that into account. The sorts of technologies that we invest in, that we deploy, all of the way we respond, the things we worry about should actually be different from the ones that are in our minds. And so that's part of this quest for information to enable this transition.
Well, you're the right person to go to. Thank you very much, Michael Liebreich, for being with us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.